Today, we're going to make a more advanced Aqua style button. Let's go. Okay, so we're in the middle of a series of shader tutorials on creating procedural shapes and patterns. Last week, we created a simple button UI element that doesn't use any texture samples and is resolution independent. If you haven't seen the other videos in this series yet, check out the playlist down in the description. We're going to be using material covered in previous videos today, so get caught up first before working through this one. When macOS X was first introduced, it used a style of user interface called Aqua. The buttons look like this. So this is the button we're going to make today. And we're going to make it procedurally, so it doesn't use any textures and it's resolution independent. This reference image is a good illustration of the problems with using textures. When you try to zoom into an element or make it large, if you're using a texture, it starts to look low res and poor quality like this image, especially you can see this around the edges of the button. And this is true unless you use a really high resolution texture, and that costs a lot of texture memory. But if you use procedural math to generate the UI element instead, you can make it resolution independent, so it can get as big as you want and still be super sharp. All right, now, because this button is a bit complex, we're going to divide the process into two parts. This week, we're going to set up the color of the button, create the fresnel effect and the specular highlight that you can see here. And then next week, we're going to create the button drop shadow, the translucency, and then set up the pressed and moused over states for the button. All right, so let's switch over to Unity and we'll jump right into making our button. We're going to do it in Unity first, and then in a minute, we're going to jump into Unreal and make the same button there. So I'm going to start out by finding this subgraph that we created last week called Simple Button, and I'm just going to select it and pick Control-C and Control-V for copy and paste. And it's going to make a duplicate of my button. And this one, instead of being called Simple Button, I'm going to name it Aqua Button. All right, let's open up this subgraph and we'll jump right into making our button. Okay, so last week, the first thing that we did is we set up the color of our button. So here you can see our button color coming in. And if we open up our blackboard and our graph inspector, you can see that our button color has this default color here. Now, in our case, I want our button to be just a little bit more vibrant. And so instead of this being our default color, I'm going to paste in this other color, and I'll show you the values here, 0, 0.4823, and 1 for RGB. So that's going to give our button just a little bit more vibrance. So this is the shader that we created last week for the simple button. And instead of doing this, what I'm going to do is drag in our button color. And I'm going to make a gradient. If we check out our reference here, you can see that our Aqua button goes from being kind of dark at the top to light at the bottom. And then it has this kind of specular highlight or reflection overlaid on top. But especially over here on the right side and on the left side, you can see that there's this gradient that goes from dark to light. And that's the part of the button we're going to be creating now. So in order to create that gradient, right now, I just have a single color. And so what I'm going to do is add in 2 hue nodes. And what we're going to do is shift this color up and down along the color wheel. So there's my first hue node, and I'll copy and paste it, and there's my second hue node. Now for this first one, I'm going to offset, let's see, I'm going to plug in my button color here to both of these. And right now they each have an offset of 0. And I want to make this one an offset of -26. And I want to make this one an offset of +13. So now you can see from this one color, I've created two color variations. And now I need to blend between these two colors that I've created using a lerp. So I'll add a lerp node here and plug the first hue into the A input port and the second hue into the B input port. Okay, so I've got my lerp, and now I need to blend between my two colors using a gradient. So I'm going to come down here to the UVs that I created, and here is the pressed state, and what this is doing is it makes the button move down and to the right when the button is pressed. And we're going to do some more work on this next week, but what I want to do is grab my UV coordinates from here. And I'm going to bring my UV coordinates up, and I'm going to add a linear gradient node. And this is a node that we've created in a previous video. And in order to do this correctly, I'm going to invert my linear gradient and then use the V, or the vertical gradient coming out of here. Here in the preview, you can see the horizontal gradient, but I'm going to use the vertical gradient. And I'm going to adjust it just a little bit. So I'm going to come over here and add an inverse lerp node and plug our linear gradient into the T port. And now you can see the gradient that we're creating. But we need to adjust this just a little bit. And so in order to adjust it, I'm going to type 0.06 for the A value and 0.57 for the B value. And that's going to compress my gradient just a little bit. All right, we'll move these nodes over here. And the last thing that I do after I create an inverse lerp is saturate it, because inverse lerps tend to allow values to go outside the 0 to 1 range. And in this case, we don't want that. So now that I've got my gradient, I can use this value to blend between my two hue values, my light blue and my dark blue. And now I've got some nice shades that I can use for my Aqua button. Just like we saw in the reference, here it's darker at the top and lighter at the bottom. And here it's darker at the top and lighter at the bottom. All right, let's clean up our graph a little bit. And the next thing that we need to do is create the pill shape. Last week when we created our simple button, it's just using a rectangle shape, and that's what we have here. And one of the things that we kind of discovered by accident, and I don't think I mentioned it in the video, but if we set, so this rectangle sign distance field node is a node that we created a couple of episodes ago, and we're able to control the roundness of each of the corners. And if we increase, so let's say we give each of the corner, when we can control these separately. So a value of 0.3 makes this corner much more round than the others. And what we want for our Aqua button is a pill shape. And so as I was saying, one of the things that we discovered by accident is that if we set these values high enough, we can create a pill shape here. So in this case, I've set them to 0.4, and I've got a really nice pill shape from what otherwise is supposed to be a rectangle sign distance field shape. So that's pretty cool. But one thing that we need to take into consideration is if I change the dimensions of our button. So right now our dimensions are set to 0.8 width and 0.4 height. But if I set our height to something like 0.6, say, then the value of 0.4 for our rounded corners is no longer making this a pill shape. So what I really need to do is set the corner radii to be the same value as our dimensions y. So I'm going to take our dimensions, which are x and y here, 0.8 and 0.6. Let's set the default back to 0.4. And if I split this out, I'm going to add a split node here and grab the second channel. I can use this y value of our dimensions to drive the corner radii. And now, no matter what I make these dimensions, I'm always going to get a pill shape out of our rectangle SDF shape. So that's a pretty cool little hack, a nice little trick that you can use to make our rectangle SDF into a pill shape. All right, let's set our dimensions back to 0.4. And now instead of a rectangle button, our simple button has become a pill shape button. So that's pretty cool. What we need to do is take the sign distance field resolution of our pill shape button and multiply it by the color gradient that we've created up here. So I'm just going to come up here and add a multiply node, and then multiply that by our pill shaped button that we created there. And we've got a really nice beginning for our Aqua style button. We've got the pill shape, and we have a really nice gradient from kind of a dark blue to a light blue. One thing that I wanted to do with the color is if I pick the button color value here, and if we slide around this color wheel, what you can see is because we're using these hue nodes here, no matter what I set my color value to, it's always going to create a really nice gradient for me. I can create kind of an orange and pink gradient, or kind of a lime, green, and yellow gradient, or I can create my nice blue and light blue gradient, which is what we were doing before. Okay, let's move on. The next thing that we need to do is make our button feel round, because even though it does have a nice gradient, it still feels kind of like a flat two-dimensional image. And the way we're going to make it feel round is by adding a fake fresnel around the edges. Just a little bit of lightening around the edges to make this feel like a three-dimensional shape instead of a two-dimensional shape. Okay, so let's come down here to our rectangle SDF again. And here you can see that we're creating an outline. So we have our SDF stroke value coming out of here, and then we're using our anti-aliasing nodes to create a nice outline around the edge of our button. And we can use this outline to create our fake fresnel as well. So coming out of our rectangle SDF, we have this SDF stroke value, and I'm going to bring that value up here, and we're going to create an inverse lerp node, and I'm going to plug the SDF stroke output of our rectangle SDF into the T value of our inverse lerp, which is going to allow us to control the thickness of our outline. So for the thickness values, I'm going to give it a -0.2 and a 0.06. And what I'm going for is just kind of a soft, subtle gradient that I can add to my button shape here to give the illusion that the shape is rounded. And so I'm going to do my inverse lerp here, then I'm going to saturate the result, and now we're just going to do just a little bit of adjusting here to get just the right effect. First, we need to add a 1- node to inverse this effect, and then we need to make it just a little bit more subtle. And so I'm going to take this effect that I've got here and multiply it by 0.6 just to darken it down a little bit. And now I can take this pill shape with our gradient and add this nice fake fresnel effect here to get a shape that feels a little bit more rounded. Okay, so you can see the button here, and it's right around the edges of the button. We have this kind of brightening effect from our fresnel that gives the illusion that the button is just a little bit more round. Okay, let's close down our previews here and clean up just a little bit. And then we're going to add the last effect that we're going to do today. And this is the most complicated. If we take a look at our reference again, you can see that there's this kind of white gradient shape up here at the top. And what this is it's a reflection of the light source of the scene, or a specular highlight. So that's what we're going to do last. And we'll come up here to the top, and I'm going to create the specular highlight up here in this portion of the graph. And in order to do this, I need to take my rectangle sign distance field node, and we're going to duplicate it. And I need two things. I need to size and scale this shape so that it fits right in here at the top. And then the other thing that I need to do is multiply the shape by a mask so that I'm only seeing like the first half of the shape. Because you can see I've got kind of this pill shape, but the bottom here is cut off so that I only see the top half of it. And so we're going to do those two things next. First of all, I want to make sure that I get this pill-shaped SDF shape the right dimensions. So I'm going to bring in my dimensions value. And in order for this shape to fit inside the button, I want to multiply our dimensions by 0.9 so that we're scaling this version down just a little bit. Whatever the original dimensions of the overall button are, I'm going to take just 0.9 or 90% of those dimensions, and we're going to make that the size. So we're going to make this one just a little bit smaller than the outer shape of the button. Okay, and then just like we did for the outer shape of the button, we need to set the values here for the corner radius. And so I'm going to take my dimensions coming in here, and we're going to split out the Y. And then in this case, I'm going to subtract a value of 0.05 just to make the corner radius just a little bit smaller. And then I'm going to wire this into our corner radius value. And now you can see that's given me a nice round shape here. Okay, the next thing that we need to do is bring the UVs into the rectangle to get this object in the right spot. And this part is just a little bit complicated, so I hope you'll bear with me here. I've created a solution for this that adapts to the dimensions of the button, and it works okay, but I'm not convinced that this is the best solution, but this is what we're going to use for now. And maybe you can come up with something better than I did. So what we want to do is move this specular highlight value up to the top of the button. And as the button gets larger, we want the specular highlight to move up and put itself in the correct location relative to the button. And so what I'm going to do here is we're going to add a multiply node, and we're going to set this to 0.8. So we're taking our Y dimension here, and we're going to invert it, and then multiply this invert value by 0.8. And then we're going to take our Y dimension here, and we're going to multiply it by the result of these two nodes. So basically, we're trying to find a value to move our button up. And we've taken that Y dimension and then multiplied it by 1 minus times 0.8. And now we're going to add a vector 2 node. And because we only want our button, we only want our specular highlight to move in the Y dimension, we're going to plug this into the Y dimension here and leave the X dimension at 0. So this is going to be a modifier for the UV coordinates that we're plugging into our rectangle SDF. So I need to come down here and grab our original UV coordinates from this branch node here. And we're going to bring that up. And I'm going to plug that into a scale node into the UV coordinates of the scale. And we're going to scale those UV coordinates by the input dimension value here. And then we're going to take those UV coordinates and subtract out the value that we've calculated here. All right, so I'm going to bring this up here and create a subtract node. And then from those coordinates, we're going to subtract this value here. And that's going to be our UVs for our button. There is one more thing that we need to do, though. We need to saturate our result. So there's our saturate. And now we can plug our UV coordinates into our sign distance field. And you can see that here, the new pill shape that we're creating has been squeezed a little bit and moved up a little bit. And that's the result that we're looking for. Now you might notice here that our edge is a little bit sharp, and we want to blur that out a little bit. And so for our edge max value, I'm going to type a value of 0.06, and that's going to give us just a little bit softer edges. Okay, now just for fun, just temporarily, I'm going to take the result of our value here and create an add and add it to our color. And you can see we're starting to get a nice specular highlight, and it's in a pretty good position, but we don't yet have this fall off value where if you see in our reference, the specular highlight is bright here at the top, but then as we come down, it gets darker. So we need to set up this mask here that's going to blend out our specular highlight as we come down toward the center of the button. All right, so let's come back over here, and we're going to take this value that we created for our UV coordinates and isolate just the Y coordinate, because that's going to give us the gradient that we need to mask out the bottom portion of our specular highlight shape. So we're going to use another inverse lerp node. We're using these a lot to manipulate our sign distance fields or our gradients. And this one we're going to set to 0.45 and 0.9. And now you can see I've got a nice mask that goes from white to grayscale gradient here and then to black. And we're going to saturate our result. And this is what we're going to use as our mask. So I'm going to take the fill value coming out of our rectangle sign distance field node here, and we're going to multiply it by this mask that we've created. And now you can see that this gradient here is allowing our shape to be bright at the top, and then as we come down, we get darker, which is exactly the effect that we're looking for. All right, again, we'll clean up our graph just a little bit, get our nodes all laid out nicely. And now, instead of using the result coming out of our sign distance field, we can use our multiply here and plug it in. And boom, we've got a really cool looking Aqua style button. We created our gradient that goes from kind of a darker blue to a lighter blue. We created this fresnel term that softens the edges and brightens it up and makes it look a little bit more three-dimensional. And we created this specular highlight. Oh, one thing that I forgot to show you, if we change the dimensions of our button, because of the math that we're doing here, the specular highlight will correctly maintain its position on the button. So let's choose our dimensions. Right now we have dimensions of 0.4, but we can go to 0.5, 0.6, 0.7, and you can see that our specular highlight is maintaining its spot on the button. So we can change the dimensions of our button, and the different features of the button stay with it, and it all looks correct. All right, so that's what we're going to do for this week. Like I said, next week we're going to add the translucency to our button, add a drop shadow to our button, and then add the button states so that our button can change appearance if we mouse over it or if we press it. All right, now we're going to switch over to Unreal, and we're going to create this same button there. All right, here we are in Unreal. And here is the simple button material function that we created last week. You can see it's creating kind of this simple blue to dark blue gradient. And it's got a nice outline, rectangular shape with rounded off corners. All right, so today we're going to make a variation of this that is the more advanced Aqua button. So I'm going to open my content drawer and just pick my simple button material function and copy and paste it. And we're going to rename it to Aqua button. And I'll go ahead and open up our Aqua button here. And we're ready to go to work. So the first thing that I want to do is add our rounded corners to convert our rectangle shape here into a pill shape. And what I've discovered about our rectangle SDF node is that it's really easy to make it a pill if you change this corner radii to be the Y dimension of the dimension input. So here's my dimension input. I'm just going to add a component mask, and we'll mask off the green channel, which is our Y dimension. And if I pass our Y dimension into our corner radius, now you can see I've converted our rectangle into a pill shape. And that's what we need in order to create this Aqua button. Okay, the next thing that we want to do is create a color. So here is our button color input. And we're going to take that input. And the first thing that I want to do is, I really like the way that colors look in Unreal when they're adjusted to account for sRGB. And so I'm going to add a power node here and just raise our color to a power of 2.2. And then I'm just going to double check here and make sure that this color is a color that I like. So I'll hold down 3 and drag in. Okay, so now our color is black, but let's just go ahead and give ourselves a really nice blue color to work with here. Kind of put it up here in this range. Yeah, something kind of like that. And then when we raise it to a power of 2.2, we get a little bit nicer shade of blue. Okay, so next we need to take this color that we've got here and we need to hue shift it so that it becomes lighter and darker. And so we're going to add a hue shift node here. And for this first one, we're going to connect up our color to the texture input. This texture input here is kind of a misnomer. It really should be a color input instead. I'm going to paste a value of negative 0.1. So we'll hue shift our first value by negative 0.1. And then we'll bring this one down and connect up our color again. And this one we're going to hue shift by 0.01. These hue shift nodes work a little bit differently than they do in Unity. And so I've had to adjust my values here from what I was doing there. In Unity, the input value is degrees around the color wheel. And in Unreal, it says hue shift percentage, which if it's a percentage value, I would think that it would be between 0 and 100, but really it's between 0 and 1. So that's the amount that we're hue shifting it there. All right, so here I've got my darker blue and I've got my lighter blue. And we need to blend between these two values using a linear interpolate. So I'm going to plug that into A and that into B. And now I need an input gradient to blend between my darker blue and my lighter blue. So for my input gradient, I'm going to come down here to the UV coordinates that I've calculated. Here are my input UV coordinates, and we're moving them when the button is pressed. And so I'm going to grab my UV coordinates that are a result of this switch node here. And I'm going to wire this up here, and we're going to add a linear gradient node. And we'll connect our UV coordinates up here to the UV channel input of our linear gradient. And for our linear gradient, we want the V component, but we're going to add a 1 - here to invert that. If we preview it, you can see that now I've got a nice gradient from white to black. And now I want to adjust my gradient a little bit. I want to kind of compress it a bit. And so I'm going to add an inverse lerp here. And we'll plug our 1 - into the value. And now I can adjust my gradient using these A and B values. So I'm going to give this one a value of 0.05 or 0.06. And this one a value of 0.57. So now our gradient has been compressed a little bit in toward the middle. And then we're going to saturate the result. And we'll just kind of clean things up here. And now this is the gradient that I can use to blend between my dark blue and my light blue color. So I'm going to wire that into my lerp. And now you can see I've got a really nice gradient between my darker blue value. This one's kind of like darker and more purple. And this one's lighter and kind of pushed toward the green end of the spectrum. So now that kind of matches the values that I'm seeing here in my reference, where I have kind of a dark blue at the top and a light blue at the bottom. Okay, so there's my color. And now I need to multiply my color by the mask that I've created with my rectangle. So here's my rectangle sign distance field. I'm resolving it with my anti-aliasing and then doing a 1-. And so this will give me the mask that I need to multiply by my color up there. So I can grab this and wire up a multiply node. And now I've got my color multiplied by my mask, and that's really nice looking. Okay, the next thing that I need to do is make this shape feel a little bit more three-dimensional. Right now it has a nice gradient on it, but it feels really flat. And in order to make it more three-dimensional, what I'm gonna do is kind of do a fake fresnel term. And so I'm gonna get the outline SDF from my SDF node here. Here's my SDF stroke value coming out. So I'm gonna wire this value up here and connect it to my inverse lerp. And this inverse lerp is going to allow me to adjust the gradient just a little bit. Right now my sign distance field outline looks like this. And I'm gonna adjust it. I'm gonna add a -0.2. And then for the other value, I'm gonna add a 0.06. So now you can see I just have a really subtle outline here. And I'm gonna saturate this and invert it by adding a 1-. And now I have a mask that is kind of right around the edges of my pill-shaped button. I want to tone it down just a little bit because I want the Fresnel effect to be a little bit more subtle. And so I'm going to multiply by 0.6, and that's going to give me just a little bit more subtle outline. And now I can take this outline and add it to what I've got here to make it feel a little bit more three-dimensional. So I'm going to create an add node and add my outline to my shape. And now you can see, because my edges are just a little bit glowy, it makes it feel a little bit more round. Okay, the final effect that we're going to add today is the specular highlight, or the reflection of the light source. You can see right here at the top of the button, there's this kind of white reflection on the top, and that represents the light source in the scene reflecting off the top of the button. And so we need to create another sign distance field shape of the pill that we can use for that effect. So I'm going to grab my rectangle SDF node here and copy and paste it. And we'll drag it up here to the top. And for this one, we're going to set the edge max to 0.06. And I'll wire that in. And that's going to make our shape just a little bit more fuzzy. Just for temporary, I'm going to add a saturate node here and open this up so that we can see what our shape is looking like. Right now, it's a rectangle, and that's obviously wrong. So we need to fix up our corner radii. And so just like we did with the one down here, we're going to take our dimensions, mask off the G. But in this case, I want to subtract a small value so that the corner radii are just a little bit smaller. So I'm going to subtract a value of 0.05 and wire that into our corner radii input port. Now you can see we've got these nice round edges. Okay, we also need to control the size of our rectangle SDF. And we're going to do that with our dimensions input. So here's our dimensions. And in this case, instead of wiring dimensions directly into size, I'm going to multiply these by 0.9 so that our specular highlight is just a little bit smaller than the outside shape of our button. So we'll wire that into size and refresh our preview here. And now you can see I've got a nice pill-shaped button with some fuzzy edges because we've set our edge max to 0.06. Okay, the next thing that we need to do is adjust the position of our pill shape here. We want to add this specular highlight so it's kind of up here at the top of our shape. And right now it's just kind of right in the middle. And so let's go ahead and adjust the UV coordinates that we're going to use for our rectangle to move this shape kind of up toward the top of the button. And the way that I'm going to do that is, once again, we need to come down here to our UV coordinates. And I'm going to mask out the red channel. And again, I'm going to mask out the green channel. And we're going to bring these UV coordinates up to the top of our shader so that we can use them as our UVs here. But first, before I do that, I want to invert my green channel UVs so that I can flip them from top to bottom. And now I'm going to put them back together. So I'm going to use an append vector node and wire in my X and my Y that's been inverted. And these are the UV coordinates that I can use for my rectangle now. So I can wire these directly in. We're going to do some adjustments in between here and here. But for now, I just wanted you to see that if we wire those in, we're still getting the same shape. Okay, the first thing that we need to do with our UVs is we need to scale them. So I'm going to come down here to the library of nodes that we've been building as we've been going along with the videos in this series. Come in here to our UV folder, and we're going to add our scale material function here. And I'm going to connect my UVs up to the scale. And then for the scale here, we're going to go ahead and connect our dimensions. So I'll come down here to my dimensions and wire that up to our scale. And so now if I wire this in, what you'll see, if we refresh our preview again, is that we've shrunk down our specular highlight based on its dimensions so that we're kind of getting a more compressed and stretched shape. Okay, the next thing that we need to do is alter these UVs so that we can move that shape up to the top of the button. So in order to do that, I'm going to use the Y coordinate. And I'm going to invert it here. Now, this method that I'm using is going to adapt the positioning of the specular highlight depending on the dimensions of the button. And this is a good way that I've found that seems to work to me, but it's possible that you can find a better way to make the positioning kind of relative to the height of the button dimensions. But that's what I'm going for here. We're going to take this inverted Y coordinate and we're going to multiply it by 0.8. And now we're going to multiply that by the Y coordinate itself. And now we just want to add to the Y coordinate and not the X coordinate. So I'm going to add a 0 value here. And then we're going to add an append. And I'm going to put 0 in the A, and I'm going to put this value into the B. So this is the amount that we're going to offset the UV coordinates. So now the UVs coming out of scale here, I can subtract out this value. So I'm going to add a subtract node and then wire these coordinates in. So we're computing a value to offset this, and then we're subtracting that from our original UV coordinates. And now I can wire this into my rectangle SDF as the UVs. And again, if we refresh our preview, now you can see that our specular highlight has moved up. Now just temporarily, we can take this value here and add it into the result of the rest of our shader to see what we're getting. And you can see we have a nice specular highlight here. But there is one thing missing from this result, and that is in our reference, you can see that this specular highlight is only half of the shape. And there's this nice gradient where it fades out toward the bottom. So that's the next thing that we're going to do. we're gonna make this specular highlight shape fade out as we get closer to the center of the button. So in order to do that, we need to take a gradient that's based on our coordinates here. We're gonna use the Y coordinate. So I'm gonna add another component mask here and mask out the G, or the Y coordinate. And then and this in itself is a gradient. You can see we've got a nice gradient here, but we need to adjust it a little bit. And so I'm gonna add an inverse lerp node again, and this will allow us to compress our gradient. And we'll connect up our value here. And here we're gonna add a value of 0.45 and 0.9. And then we're gonna saturate the result. And this is gonna become the gradient that we can use to multiply by our shape. So now I can take our shape value here and multiply it by our coordinate gradient that we just created there. And now you can see I've got this shape here that instead of being a full pill shape, it falls off toward the middle. And so instead of taking this result, I can add this result to it. And now I've got a really cool looking specular highlight at the top of the button. All right, let's clean up our graph just a little bit. Maybe minimize these previews that we don't need. And we've got our nice final result. Now, as I said, because this was a little bit complicated to create, next week we're gonna go ahead and create the translucency of our button and the drop shadow of our button. And we're also gonna create the moused over state and the pressed state for our button. So I hope you come back next week for that. Thanks a lot for watching, and have a great week, everybody.